Hello and welcome to today's webinar presentation, The Contract Connection. My name is Richard Waugh. I'm from Zycus, and we're proud to be presenting as the sponsor for this webinar in association and collaboration with IACCM. So our topic today is the contract connection. You can see we have this graphic here that kind of shows the contract as the nexus of a variety of activities across the sourcing and procurement spectrum, connecting various stakeholders, governance, tracking and monitoring procedures, flowing through to the bottom line. We see the contract as the glue that cements all these different stakeholders and business processes together. And for today's session, we really want to look at how interconnected contracts are, how they affect the organization overall. And to do that, I'm pleased to be joined by Tim Cummins. Tim is the president and CEO of IACCM, and he's a well-known authority on everything to do with contracting and relationship management, working with a variety of leading corporations, public and academic bodies, really driving to the forefront awareness of the critical role that contract management plays in business. And his writing has been extensively published, and he's acted in an advisory capacity globally with various governmental bodies from the U.S., U.K., Australia, Canada, and Japan, and regularly briefs senior managers at some of the world's largest companies how to maximize value from contract management. In addition, I'll be joining Tim today. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Development at Zycus. Not nearly as illustrious and extensive resume here as Tim's, but been around the technology space long enough to comment specifically on how the contract management from a technology standpoint connects across the source-to-pay continuum. And in the second half of today's discussion, I'll be highlighting some of those connection points from a technology standpoint. So without further ado, I'd like for Tim to kind of share some of his thoughts, including some very fresh market research that's been done, surveying a variety of respondents on just how they're utilizing and gaining value from contract management as a connector in their business. So without further ado, Tim.
Richard, thank you. It's great to be working with you again. And as you say, we will be introducing at least a select set of the findings from that recent study. And I think a number of those, of course, who contributed to it are with us today. For those who are interested in participating, it's still available and open, so they can always get in touch and, of course, see as a result the wider results if what we touch on today starts to intrigue them. So, as you've highlighted, our theme in many ways is around connections and being connected, and I think most of us are only too aware that really the risks within which we're operating today, whether we're in procurement or sales contracting, are very much globally connected. We are, none of us, in places where we can readily hide, and whether it's geopolitical issues, the instability of world regions, or of course crises such as that of Ebola or the many others that we experience frequently these days, has, I think, led us all to understand that the state of connection means that we have to be not only much more aware, but I think, importantly, much more agile, much more flexible, because many of these risks are either not predictable or the theoretical probability of the individuals is quite low. So we cannot expect or plan for everything. What we can do is build in more sustainable forms and structures to our relationship and, importantly, to our contracts to help us actually manage through this very uncertain time. And in that sense, contracts really do, in their best form, make sense of complexity. So our next chart just starts to look a little bit at some of those sources of complexity. I think, first of all, and this will come as no surprise to anybody on the call today, is the challenge of a growing range of stakeholders. If we thought that things were difficult in the past, it seems like with each passing day they get worse. Not only do we face a growing number of internal and external specialists who need to be involved, but I think a growing number of interventionary forces that really do make that issue of stakeholder management, of the oversight and insight of stakeholder perspectives, particularly difficult. We've touched already on the volatility of today's markets, and you need to, of course, look at the state of the financial markets last week to appreciate that. But on the surface, we could see the stock market seesawing, but underneath all of that, we had things like commodity prices also, very unpredictable, very uncertain, and lots of debate at the moment about will Europe move into back into a recessionary stage, to what extent, are we going to see any growth in world markets, and it's all extremely unpredictable. All of us depend today on extended supply networks. One of the drivers of procurement over the last 10 to 15 years has been to outsource more and more, to push more and more into an external network, and that drives down throughout that network. So just as one company has pushed to growing volume of its business being done externally, so have its suppliers. So actually, when we look at the plethora of companies on which we depend, it is extremely risky, and risk can arise from many different sources. We had a leading economist actually presenting at our Americas conference last week. The numbers vary in terms of, Richard, I don't know what you ever see on this, but the forecasts of how much of a company's revenue on average is spent on external supply. And his number was that on average it is now well in excess of 50%. And when you get up to industries like aerospace at about 85 or automotive at about 75, it's a phenomenal percentage of dependence upon the supply network for performance. More regulation, no great surprise, probably no great need to comment, except it isn't finished. We're going to see more and more of it. The next wave of regulation probably will come in the whole area of corporate taxation. Then we have this continuous pressure on cost and on efficiency and on flexibility. Those features are not going to go away either, and they're causing organizations, businesses to look at very new and different service delivery models as we look more and more at outcome-based contracts, for example, which can deliver many of those features. And finally, perhaps not surprisingly, given that era of great complexity, we see growing pressure for increased collaboration. But collaboration does not mean in any context weakness. It doesn't mean just going to cozy relationships, quite the opposite. It means growing transparency. It means growing discipline in governance and performance management. And I think those are really critical points as we discuss the importance of contract management as a discipline, but of course as we think about that also in the context of better tools and systems to support that openness, that transparency, and that collaboration. This resonates with you, Richard, or not?
Oh, it does, and I think these trends just continue to increase, as you mentioned, across vertical markets. A greater percentage of revenues consumed by spending with outside suppliers. The global nature of those supply networks and the increased overhead and oversight of various regulations just heighten all these issues.
So as we dwell on that and move to our next chart, what's the problem? I mean, why is contracting and contract management not rapidly responding to the sort of environment that I've just been describing? And that, I think, was neatly summed up by a report, in fact an outstanding report on contract management by the UK's National Audit Office, which has been looking very, very seriously at this topic because of its realization and absolute belief that actually contract commercial management lie at the heart of good business, and that it is, as the comment here says, not something we do well because senior managers haven't taken contract management seriously. And I imagine there are probably many nodding heads out there who would share that view, that this is something that for those in the community, they've been struggling to try to get greater recognition and understanding of the business, economic, bottom line significance of contracts, and to stop viewing them simply as mechanisms for overseeing compliance, particularly legal compliance, and a very narrow view of what they can contribute to the business. So let's build from there, and our next chart just tells us that the encouraging news, we now start to move into the survey results. Now our survey was pretty good participation. We had over 300 corporations represented in providing us with answers, so it's a fairly robust set of data. And as you can see from this first chart, management does seem to be increasingly grasping the need for improvement in contract management, the expectation that it can actually deliver greater value than it is today, and that it is something that merits their attention. Now you can see some fairly variable figures, but of course these different regions start from very different bases. And perhaps it's not surprising in a region like Africa, where the majority of contracts are still very much commodity type, natural resources, that it isn't maybe given quite the same emphasis as it is in some other regions, but it still isn't that far adrift. Pretty encouraging numbers, Richard, I think, don't you?
Most definitely, and I think, certainly the vast majority here north of 50% indicates that it's a front burner issue instead of back burner.
Well, we certainly hope so. Both you and I need it to be, hey?
Exactly.
So let's move to a different aspect. Has that understanding of need resulted in any investment in capability? And here, actually, the numbers, interestingly, are even stronger. Now, we're going to come on and test some of this in a moment, but I think there is no question, we certainly see plenty of evidence of a very real change over the last 2 to 3 years of organizations not only walking but talking, I suppose. The range of development of capability is quite varied. And as our subsequent chart's going to show, there's still a long way to go on the journey. But in fact, we did a report on the state of commercial management just over a year ago, which similarly had concluded that contracts groups were largely being preserved. They weren't suffering as a result of the recession in the way that many others did. And in fact, in a high proportion of companies, there was actual growth. It's still a little bit variable, I guess, in terms of other forms of investment, Richard. Again, part of our problem here, I think, is that although there is this interest, many organizations have not really driven strong coordination of contracting as a business process. And without that, I guess, driving investment in the right technologies can be a tough sell, can't it? There isn't a natural champion in many cases.
That's true, and along those lines of the interconnected nature, as I'll highlight further in my section, we see contract management being explored from a technology standpoint less as a standalone point solution and more as a key component of a full source-to-pay capability, so the integration and the interconnection really becoming more and more important from a technology standpoint.
So again, some pretty encouraging numbers in terms of this capability development. So why is it that we need this life cycle view that I just mentioned? Well, our next chart just takes a quote from actually the report that's been written as a result of this particular piece of research. And as you can see, it is simply because in their best form, contracts and the contracting process really is an instrument of quality control. And leading organizations are realizing that the contract absolutely must reflect the overall brand promise. It must reflect the sort of approach that the company wants to take towards the market, and it sends a very clear message to suppliers and customers about the integrity, the honesty, and the, if you like, desirability of doing business with you as a trading partner. But of course, it's about more than that. Good contracts, in order to do that, absolutely have to span the range of internal and external stakeholders, and they need to coordinate, coalesce, integrate those views and opinions, which are often quite contrary, and it needs to make sense of them. And so good contracts absolutely align with the rules, the obligations under which performance is going to occur. So they are actually really important approaches to integration and connection across the business, and the contracting process in high-performing organizations absolutely performs that role. Again, give you a moment to comment if you wish to, Richard. I presume that that's a perspective you would agree with.
It is, and you know, this life cycle view takes into account that the contracts themselves are living documents. They often span multiple years or you know, reporting periods, and have to engage a variety of stakeholders. So again, as is my want to do, bringing this down to a technology imperative, usually that means that the things organizations first realize is the need to gain enterprise-wide visibility to these agreements, since they're going to span the entire life cycle and engage multiple stakeholders across the business, having access and controlled access, the right people seeing the right components of those agreements, often a starting point from a technology standpoint to get that visibility to the full life cycle.
Well, that's a great point you make, and it gives us a nice entry to our next chart. Because what we're going to do now is just have a quick run-through of some of the highlights, if you like, of the research results. There are many more, but we've picked out a few of the, we felt, really interesting contrasts that come, which just illustrate, I think, the point I made before, that while interest has grown and while investment has improved, there is still quite some distance to go. In fact, when we summarize the overall capability of organizations responding to the study, then on a scale of 1 to 100, the average performance right now is of 52. So a 52 is not a great mark, depending upon which country you're in. If you get a school grade of 52, then I guess if you're in the US, you're certainly in trouble when you go home. It is still a pass in most parts of Europe, which tend to have rather lower scoring systems, but it certainly isn't a brilliant score no matter where you are. So what we're going to be telling you tonight is there's plenty of opportunity here for all of us. Now, let's pick up a few of these strengths and weaknesses, and these are things that, in a way, were great illustrations of the state of where we are. So 63% say that contract management operates as a multifunction discipline. So that's encouraging news. That's nearly 2/3 that feel that there is a good multifunctional perspective in their contract management. However, picking up on the point you just made, Richard, 61%, so not far short of that same percentage, don't actually have systems that reliably maintain up-to-date versions of the contract or which allow access to users. So many people are flying blind, they're making it up, they're hoping for the best, no matter who knows what they're doing. And of course, if there's no ease of access, if there's no real visibility, then who knows what's going on. It means that people at the center are not really sure what changes might have been agreed locally, and the people locally are making changes without possibly knowing what it is that was agreed centrally. It clearly is a massive weakness, particularly given the environmental complexity that we were spelling out at the beginning. It is something that is no longer affordable, and it's a massive source of value erosion, of revenue erosion, and of savings erosion, to be more specific. Let's move on to our next chart and look at the aspects of relationships and value, where we find that 54% say that their senior management engages with customers and suppliers on a regular and planned basis to review contract performance. Now, we pick this as a strength because if it's true that 54% truly do that on a regular planned basis, then that's probably not bad news. However, one has to question all of this because 73% don't actually have contracts that incent innovation or that create shared approaches to problem solving and improvement. So if there's perhaps a very limited discussion of those two areas, you'll have to wonder what real value there is in that senior management review. What is informing them? What is motivating them? And how are we actually motivating our suppliers or handling our customers in a way that actually does drive this potential for greater value and enables proactive rather than reactive contract management? In other words, anticipating or resolving problems mutually rather than waiting for them to become claims and disputes. Let's go on and look at another aspect. We're going to look at planning and performance. So there, 58% say that they have visibility of major contract performance and ownership at board level, but 60% tell us that they're still largely reliant on the supplier for performance-related data. So again, what is the information that is being fed to the board? Is it actually a balanced perspective? Is it a shared and mutual perspective? Or do we spend a lot of our time wondering whether the data we're getting is accurate? And there have been some very interesting cases recently. They tend to be public sector because those are the ones that become visible as a result of audit. But certainly looking around the world, the growing understanding that actually the quality of data and the quality of performance management is woefully poor. And our indicators are that that's often the case also in the private sector. So going on from that one, let's take a look at our fourth area, relationships and risk. So there we have 50% that tell us that their organization has a strategic approach to managing customer and supplier relationships. So strategic account management, strategic relationship management certainly are growing. Well, on the sell side, of course, they're no way new, but certainly on the buy side, it is a growing discipline. There is growing focus on SRM as a meaningful discipline. However, 70% don't share risk registers and don't work together with their customer suppliers on mitigation. So how effective is this strategic approach to managing a relationship if we don't actually have shared understanding of what the risks are and if we're not working collaboratively to mitigate them? I think raises some real concerns, that one, doesn't it, Richard?
It does, yeah. It kind of makes you wonder in some cases where we cited a strength, it could be somewhat aspirational, as in I know that's where I want to get to, but in some cases the evidence, if you will, that something like shared risk is in place as part of those agreements is not yet there.
And I think you're on a key word there. I think that's right. I think there is still a degree of aspiration. However, I did mention at the conference last week that I think I do sense that we've got a community now that really believes in progress. My feeling in past years is that many of them were there aspiring to change, aspiring to greater focus on contract management. This year, it really did feel like they're getting that attention and that they know they're going to make progress. But so I suppose the optimistic view of this is to say, well, it is an area that still needs quite a lot of attention, but it is getting it. And the fifth area we picked out as our next chart is people and skills, where we have, again, a very interesting contrast where 51% say that their organization has the right people in place to undertake contract management, but 71% say they don't actually have sufficient skilled staff to ensure effective oversight and governance of contracts. So an apparent contradiction here, and I think my explanation for that would be that I suspect that 51% were answering it in the context of themselves and their immediate colleagues in procurement, legal, contract management, wherever they are, where the leadership, if you like, for the organization, the function charged with contract management in a general sense, may feel it's got a pretty high skill level, but if they look more broadly across the business, and their executive by and large in our experience would agree with this, that contract and commercial capability, competence, acumen, whatever you call it, is not present. And I think this is a really important point, because what we're seeing is that although executive management wants to improve contract management and is prepared to invest, that doesn't translate into them wanting to hire hundreds more people. What they're looking for the forward-thinking, the positive contract management groups, legal groups, procurement groups to do is increasingly to disseminate their knowledge to facilitate better performance around the business. It's our responsibility not to try and control everything through central review and approval, but much more to facilitate improvement of performance for the business as a whole by enabling them with better knowledge. Now, my perspective, and I'd be interested in yours, Richard, I don't know how anybody's going to do that if they're not actually using better tools and systems to actually spread that knowledge and make information more generally available.
You're right. I think we've highlighted the importance of collaboration. And I think your point is well taken, Tim, that maybe within the contracts group itself, they feel like they're pretty well equipped, but the fact of the matter is that given the complexity and the scope of these agreements, it has to involve these various other stakeholders. So to your point, how do you do that with the complexity involved and the global nature without effective collaboration tools? So hopefully there's some pent-up demand.
Well, moving to that pent-up demand, let's then move to our call to action that comes out of what we're observing going on in the market and what this survey has told us. And I think a couple of great quotes here, very encouraging in many ways. So far as the UK's National Audit Office is concerned, they were very clear. Contract management must become a distinct and respected specialism, and they're talking about it being absolutely on a par with procurement, project management, finance, and other disciplines. So that, I think, was, and indeed the UK government has acted fast on that and is rapidly building and investing in contract and commercial management skills and capabilities. It's been a dramatic and rapid move. But moving away from the public sector, I mean, obviously McKinsey, as leading strategic consultants to executive management, have quite substantial influence in the private sector as well as the public sector, and they are increasingly advocating the professionalization of contract management as a critical step, which of course is probably one of the features or factors that is driving what our members are observing in terms of increased management interest. But a word of warning here, they're not going to expect us to just sit back and glory in the sudden attention. They do expect us to have a grasp and an understanding of what the steps are going to be to truly lead to a professionalized capability. So again, hopefully many of the hints and tips in this webinar tonight are helpful in indicating some of the things we need to be thinking about. But if we want a few more specific items to think about, let's look at our next chart, where we try and summarize, I suppose, 3 key action points around contracts as a connector. One, I think, absolutely we believe in, and we've been pushing now from IACCM for some time, is the need to start thinking about much greater integration between the contract and the relationship. That may take the form of relational contracting, something, again, we certainly advocate. That really brings in many of those governance, performance management, and collaborative aspects that we talked about earlier. But it also means that we stop thinking in terms of, the old old adage of it doesn't really matter what the contract says, it's the relationship that matters. These two must be integrated. They must be consistent. Secondly, I think the point we touched on, we need to think about contract management and those charged with responsibility for it as enabling the business, not something that is there to control, to oversee pure compliance, or as a review and approval mechanism of the idiots out there in the business. We really have to try and de-idiotize them, and it's our job and our responsibility to disseminate the knowledge that they need to make better decisions and to exercise better judgment. Of course, we need also the systems that maintain insight and consolidated views, that have repositories of data that enable us to do much more substantive analytics with that data. And thirdly, we need to make sure that the contracts we produce and the process we're using is actually designed for users and the broader stakeholders and truly is a positive reflection of the company, the corporation, the organization's brand. I think those are three really fundamental messages, and I'm just going to move to my final chart, which says, essentially, guys, the spotlight is upon us. The time is now to start moving center stage. At the moment, that stage is looking a little bit empty, but we have a wonderful opportunity to go fill it. And Richard, with that, I'm going to, if I may, pass over to you, because I suspect you're going to help us to understand how we could fill it.
Oh, thanks so much, Tim. Absolutely. And thanks for really framing the discussion today, I think, very effectively and really highlighting what are the drivers here that have brought contract management as a connector and the contract connection to the forefront. You know, it's all the things you mentioned. It's the increasingly global nature of the business. It's a much heightened kind of state of oversight and governance, and the need to engage multiple stakeholders across the business that has really, heightened awareness here, and certainly encouraging results from the survey that you shared with us, Tim, that even if not all the underlying capabilities or tools are fully there yet to support the goals, it's clear that more and more organizations are thinking along the lines of viewing the contract capability and discipline as strategic and connected to the rest of the business. So as we segue into my portion, I wanted to highlight technology adoption in the domain of contract management, specifically within the context of an overall source-to-pay approach. So the notion, again, that contract management is not an island of automation. It's not a point solution. It, in fact, integrates all the other processes across the source-to-pay spectrum. And what I wanted to do is start out actually with results from a study that Zycus has done, so a separate study from the contract management one that we've just been referring to. This is what we call the pulse of procurement, and a study that was published earlier this year. And of course, Zycus is a software provider, a technology provider with a fully integrated source of source-to-pay tools. So one of the things that we always want to make sure we're keeping the pulse on is what are the technology adoption trends in our market. So the first data point that I wanted to share with you looks across the various application spaces within source-to-pay. So things like spend analysis, e-sourcing, supplier management, procurement process or supplier performance management, as well as procure-to-pay, in addition to contract management. And one of the interesting findings here actually surprised me, quite frankly, is just how high the survey results showed that the penetration of contract management technology was. So nearly two-thirds said that they had already invested in contract management tools below only spend analytics as an application space from an adoption standpoint. So some of the things that I would have expected to see further penetration, perhaps more mature, would be tools like e-sourcing and procure-to-pay, which can be oftentimes deployed quickly, particularly in the case of sourcing, to get quick returns, or have a very broad-based and far-reaching business case return on investment, such as procure to pay. It's a little bit surprising that contract management already was kind of ahead of a number of these other application areas from an adoption standpoint. So that was interesting. In addition, though, I think the other trend that's emerging that we see in the space is putting contract management in this context, that it's part of an integrated source-to-pay suite, and that contract management has to interrelate and interoperate with tools like spend analytics or sourcing or supplier management and the others. And I'll highlight that a little bit further as we go along. But one of the things I wanted to do at this point is actually now poll our audience today, and maybe a slightly more granular level than what we just showed on adoption, because sometimes when we talk about contract management, that can be, from a technology application standpoint, that may mean only a repository, a searchable repository that houses all the agreements, or it may mean authoring tools as well. So the question as we framed it here is kind of say, what is the most true about your current contract management infrastructure, technology infrastructure? And the choices here, I'll just read them as you can go ahead and start to weigh in on our poll, is A, have you deployed full contract management applications that consist of both a repository and authoring? Is it B, the contract's repository only? C, maybe the authoring tools only? Or D, is there really no contract management tool, it's still mostly done in Word? Or worse yet, there's no contract management tool and it's really still mostly paper. So a few more seconds to weigh in and we'll share the results. Tim, any early prognostications on where you think the state of the market adoption may be?
I would tend to your viewpoint, Richard. I think that in procurement groups, particularly the perspective on contract management has often been, not always, but often been fairly narrow, and does tend to gravitate more towards contracts for a compliance tool. Therefore, the tool is much, the system is much more about driving the standards, driving compliance with the standard approved terms and conditions, and therefore it is more generally a fairly narrow set of templates that are stored, and it's used for, yes, a repository, but for then monitoring compliance levels, which is quite contrary, I think, to driving business value. And of course, strategically can be fairly disastrous given the volatility and the complexity of the markets that we were describing earlier.
I agree completely. And, you know, it's interesting with the results that we have here. It confirms our earlier survey of the market that contract management adoption is relatively high, in fact, higher here than what we showed if we look at kind of adding up the folks who say they've deployed a full contract management with repository and authoring at 42%, plus those that say they have a repository only 41% or maybe 3% with the authoring tool only. If my math is correct, I get about 86% that say they've deployed a contract management tool. So that's frankly a little higher than I would have expected, but again, it's in keeping with our earlier results, and it also does follow what we traditionally see for those that have done one or the other. The starting point normally is the repository, that creating visibility is often the first step in automating the contract management process, to be followed in most cases by the authoring as a step 2. So very interesting findings, again focused on contract management specifically as a standalone. And as we go through here, I want to start to build the case for the need to even with those that have already automated perhaps different aspects of contract management, to build those connections to the other sourcing and procurement functions to maximize value. So,
Richard, if I may just briefly comment, I think probably the 86% would not necessarily shock me, because a lot of those listening today are from the ICCM membership, and that will generally be a much more aware and mature group, which is why they've become part of ICCM. But equally, that awareness and that maturity, you might say, then why on earth are they bothering with the webinar? But I think the answer to that is because, again, our audience is, the membership is well aware of the fact that actually just authoring and repository is no way enough, that the demands of today's market mean that you need a much more strategic application that really is beginning to deliver far more in the way of flexibility, in terms of better analytics, in terms of better, data capture, and improved sharing of data around the business and potentially with business partners. So I suspect that there are many out there who are saying, the fact they're saying they've got one doesn't mean they like what they've got.
Great points, Tim, and as well, that's what I want to focus on too, in kind of identifying some best practices or areas to then maximize and optimize contract management as it relates to the other sourcing and procurement functions. So we'll definitely want to build upon that foundational capability that may well be in place to say, how do we take it to the next level? And, one of the other data points I just wanted to share here from our Pulse of Procurement study, which we repeated in 2014, and the prior publication of Pulse was done in 2011. So that gave us the opportunity to compare the trend in performance from the last benchmark in 2011 to this one in 2014. And the encouraging news from a contract management standpoint is certainly compliance is one of the biggest benefits that organizations hope to achieve when deploying contract management solutions. And when we contrasted their performance in the most recent study, 2014, as regards compliance, a significant improvement, so 14 percentage point increase from one period to the next in terms of the compliance that they could track, that not only being efficient about putting contracts in place, but having the visibility across the organization and the compliance routines to ensure that users are actually utilizing those contracts, making compliant purchases on contract from approved vendors at negotiated prices. So the weighted average being 55% compliance rate versus just 41% in 2011. So with that, I wanted to do just another poll question here quickly to, again, sort of set the baseline with our audience today. So with the question being, what is your current estimated contract compliance rate as defined by spend on contract and per the contract? So it's purchasing being made with the approved contracted vendors at the agreed negotiated prices and terms. So the choices here, and I'll let you go ahead and weigh in as I read them, but the first one, A, is lower compliance, less than 20%. B, moving up the pyramid, approximating the 2011 levels that we had from our previous Pulse study, 21 to 40%. C, being in that middle range, somewhere between 41 and 60%. D, 61 to 80%. And the top level compliance, choice E, would be somewhere between 81 and 100%. So again, we'll give you just a few more seconds to weigh in on the results. Again, Tim, any prognostication?
Well, if I get off mute, then I'll do a lot better.
I thought you were just waiting for the results, so your guess would be...
Well, I think we'll probably fall in the upper end of D, would be my expectation.
And very prescient, yes. I think you're right. Between D and it's almost a dead heat between D and E, which combined would say that 63%, the clear majority are above 60% compliance. Right, so it's a pretty good track record again with our group, and I think that bears out your earlier comments that certainly the membership of IACCM is on the forefront of a lot of these things, and having achieved some pretty significant results. I think one of the things we've established is a pretty good penetration of tools in contract management, pretty good compliance rates, right? But what I wanted to move into then is sort of abstracting the discussion up a level and identifying how then the connections exist between contract management and the other processes and disciplines across sourcing and procurement. And first I wanted to acknowledge that there really are various contract stakeholders with differing goals and objectives. And I think one of the important points is to understand going into this approach that, understanding that everyone has different desires and outcomes and those kinds of things, and being sensitive to that. So certainly stakeholders have to, suppliers have to be one of the stakeholders to consider in any third-party contracting arrangement. And their goals, not surprisingly, look at how do I increase my revenue and margin, how do I manage my own performance and risk in the process, whereas category supplier managers, contract managers are typically looking at this, performance from the perspective of their organization. So how do I achieve the lowest total cost of ownership, and having put in place what I consider to be the best agreements, the best total cost agreements with the best suppliers, make sure that they're being utilized and being complied with across the business. Other stakeholders within the enterprise then have a completely different agenda, typically, than what the category or contract manager might have. Their stakeholders, such as the legal and finance group, are less focused on the business aspects and how do we manage governance, risk, and compliance. How do we make sure that we're not contracting with blacklisted suppliers, or if you're in the U.S., we're compliant with regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley, or substitute, the relevant or cognizant regulatory requirement in other geographies and other parts of the world as well. And then the business owners and business owners, they're really focused on service levels, speed to benefit, am I getting the value? So recognizing that the contract management discipline and focus needs to balance all these various stakeholder goals and objectives. So I want to start to build then these connections across source to pay. And I'll highlight these in the different areas and show you some examples here in a minute, but typically when we think about source-to-pay processes, often spend analytics tends to be the bedrock, the foundation for many procurement organizations. And the connections with the contract management discipline are extremely important in this particular area, as that foundational component, that starting point. So for instance, reliable, consistent, and accurate spend analysis data is what can inform the contract management function to really see, am I getting contract utilization? So tracking actual spend against those contracts that are in place to see that they're effective. And then tracking compliance across a couple of dimensions. So the first one being from an internal standpoint, usage. Are people buying on contract, or are they going outside? An off-contract purchase, sometimes referred to as a maverick purchase with a non-approved, non-contracted supplier. Well, without reliable and accurate and timely spend data, it's really not possible to have that level of compliance tracking from a usage standpoint. The second dimension of compliance really deals with the supplier holding up their end of the bargain. So things like purchase price variance. Are we always, when invoiced, paying the agreed to contracted rates and terms, or is there some variance that needs to be addressed with the supplier in terms of their contract performance? So that's a starting point, spend analytics. From a sourcing standpoint, often the contract management should be an input to the sourcing process. So a best practice that we've seen in this space is if I'm going out to market with an RFP or an RFI, include my standard contract terms and conditions at the very outset of the negotiating process. This can shorten your contracting cycle time later on by getting qualified bidders essentially to agree to your terms and conditions up front in the negotiation process and reducing that redlining and back and forth negotiation around T's and C's once the price has been established through the sourcing process. The other best practice is how the sourcing module in a full source-to-pay suite then integrates and flows into various downstream processes. So for instance, being able to take negotiated pricing and terms at the conclusion of an online negotiation event and pre-populate the commercial terms and pricing in the actual contractual document itself. The other connections that we established, particularly then in the area of both supplier information and supplier performance, the contracts often contain a number of things that the supplier needs to certify to or establish, certificates of insurance, for example. But those need to be continually updated and kept current. One of the things that supplier information management tools then is pull in these contractual requirements into the supplier information management tool and set up a set of automated triggers and alerts to make sure that you're always constantly in compliance. Likewise, from a supplier performance standpoint, the SLAs, the service level agreements or key performance indicators, should come directly from the contract as agreed into the supplier performance tool and establish the baseline metrics, the KPIs against which to scorecard supplier performance and keep that up to date. eProcurement is another key connection point here. So one of the best ways to ensure compliance with the contract is to make sure that the appropriate pricing and terms are available to a requisitioner at the moment of truth when they're placing an order. Frankly, that's pretty easily done when it's a standard catalog commodity purchase, which by default the pricing and terms in the catalog should be in agreement with the contract. But in fact, when it comes to indirect procurement through the eProcurement or requisitioning tools, the vast majority of that spend is non-catalog based. So the ability of the eProcurement tool to have contracted pricing and terms available to the requester at the point that they're placing the order for items like services is really key in establishing full compliance on total indirect spend. And the last area here of connection is with the financial savings management. It's really when all of this flows through to the bottom line, being able to track that you've actually captured the savings by being able to map paid invoices to the contract, see that it's in agreement, and that you've actually implemented the savings. The other best practice here is to have contract management terms based on the forecasted volumes and pricing establish the savings forecast to be subsequently validated by the actual result. So just to give you then a quick glimpse of what this looks like, from a spend analytics standpoint, I've got a couple of snapshots here to show you. One is utilization. So the idea is with the stoplight metaphor, red, yellow, green, to be able to quickly at a glance see are contracts being utilized by the business, or when this green line is, let's say, less than half full and you're 3/4 of the way through the year, we're well behind the forecasted volume or utilization, so that alerts the contract manager to take action. Likewise, purchase price variance, very revealing to be able to see that in some cases the same item we're paying grossly different prices, and on occasion even from the same supplier, so purchase price variance in that case. Another example then, on the sourcing side, being able to bring in standard terms and conditions right into the RFQ. So as an example, stating up front how purchase orders will be handled, the various contract outline terms and conditions incorporated into the RFQ process itself. On the supplier side, just giving you, again, a quick glimpse, tracking those KPIs, the SLAs that would come directly from the contract, actually adding milestones into the contract document itself for statement of work related efforts is then going to serve as the baseline for tracking supplier performance to hitting those particular milestones. eProcurement, this is the idea of creating this visibility. So it's a non-catalog requisition, but showing the user based on the type of category that they intend to purchase and make a requisition for, these are the available agreements, and having that the effective pricing and terms available to the users at the point of requisition, that moment of truth, is going to ensure compliance. And the last connection that I wanted to establish here, the financial savings connection. So typically we'll set up a savings opportunity tracking methodology here, pulling in directly from the contract, both the historical agreement and the new contract, information on targeted and baseline volumes, pricing, and then measuring variance against those. So those are some of the other areas to think about, the connections that contracts and contract management needs to make across the source-to-pay spectrum. And just to conclude, and set the context for Zycus, contract management is a critical component of an overall source-to-pay suite. So we've delineated between strategic and operational functions how it all comes together to form a comprehensive and integrated source-to-pay approach from a technology standpoint. And wanted to mention we've shared a lot of best practices in our discussion today. Upcoming is a conference that's specifically intended for best practice sharing and networking. It's called Horizon. It's coming up November the 9th through the 11th in Amelia Island, Florida. A variety of thought-leading speakers, including the esteemed Mr. Cummins, on the agenda to talk about contract management and its importance within source-to-pay. And as an added benefit, all of the attendees at today's webinar that choose to register for the conference will get a special promotional rate. So recognize we've gotten to the question slide and probably only a couple of quick minutes left in our program today, but we had a lot of information to share with you. Tim, any burning questions on your mind that you'd like to address before we conclude?
You know, Richard, I don't know that I have got burning questions. I think we've, as you said, covered a tremendous amount of ground, and hopefully we've confirmed what to many people is actually a very real belief that we are on a very important stage of this journey, and that having gained control, we now really need to move to an environment where we're adding far more creativity, and where the intervention of contracts groups, whether in procurement or on the sell side, is actually much more holistic. It's actually ensuring that the right trading partners are engaged with, that the right form and frame of contract is put in place, and that there is then robust overall governance and performance management to ensure the outcome, the optimum outcome is achieved.
Excellent insights, Tim, absolutely, and regret that we won't have time for all the questions that came in. I did note one that I'll tackle real quickly here since it relates specifically from a systems and technology standpoint, because it touches on a critical aspect, is talking about, is this a dashboard capability, and if so, how does it integrate ERP data sources? So certainly, it's both. The technology component encompasses dashboard visibility, also process management and key functionality to manage the entire contract workflow, but it also integrates that critical component of ERP data resources. So as I mentioned, things like making the contract and contract management a living document, not just something that you put on the shelf at the end of the contracting process, really requires pulling in data from sources like ERP and actual invoices, for example, to be able to track utilization and spend and compliance against the contract. So it definitely not only integrates business processes and stakeholders, but also integrates other data sources such as ERP. So I think we've covered, again, a lot of ground. You've got our contact information here. Both Tim and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that we didn't have the chance to address today. And we, of course, invite you to join us for Horizon and other future webinars that we plan in this series. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. Have a great evening.